This conference will now be recorded.
All right, well, welcome everyone. And just so you know, we are live streaming this to people that maybe for one reason or another might not want to come to the Center of Excellence. So you can log in when we make our announcement of these meetings. The login information is available for anyone who would like to do this remotely. But we love to see your faces here and appreciate such a good turnout today. Even though the hearings on television are going on and are riveting and saying a lot of things that we all need to pay attention to. But we have a program today where our guest, Aggie Lane, will be speaking of things that we all really need to pay attention to. So I appreciate you being here today. As usual, before we start the presentation, we'd like to go quickly around the room. So why don't we just say our name, and if you have a little affiliation that you want us to know about, please let us know that too. So.
Greg Lewis.
Brian Bradley, president of Green USA.
Melanie Neal, I'm a member.
Aggie later, Judge Task Force.
I'm Jill Weissman with SUNY ESF, and I teach about NEPA, so I'm very interested in secondary effects, and I've got students that are interested as well.
Dick Kornbluth, CNY Solidarity Coalition.
Lois Atkinson, friend of Dave.
Yes, Dave Ashley, Meredith's partner, Ashley McGraw Architects, and Greening USA member.
Yep. Bob Haley, Greening USA member, architect, and currently working on many of the impacts of I81 through Moving People Transportation Coalition, through Rethink 81, through the AIA, constantly working on guidelines for the DOT to make this a long-term sustainable urban improvement to our city and not just a highway improvement.
Abdul Amin, a sustainability consultant. I'm at Albany Planning, Urban Design. We want to be able to fill those gaps from Albany to Buffalo. So this project works for the benefit of people locally and for the whole region.
I'm Peter King with Urban Jobs Task Force and Moving People Transport Coalition, two of the groups mentioned.
John Miranda, Syracuse resident.
Rich Brickman, Greening USA member.
Renee Perry, community member.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Before I announce or I introduce our speaker, I just want to make a couple of announcements, and maybe Diane might have something announcements to make. A note for next month, we've been able to reschedule Jason Evans to be here on December 13th, and he will talk about his efforts with the effort that he created called Rethink Syracuse, and its sister effort, Rethink I81. So another in Greening USA's continuing series on the I81 project, which has going to have such a large impact on our community. We did receive a letter from The Stand, who the news publication covering Southside News. And Ashley King writes to us and tells to announce an effort that they're making to try to find out from Southside residents their opinions about the project, believing that and which is probably true, I imagine, that the way the project has been covered may not have included enough of those voices from the South Side. So anybody who wants to, submit their comments to The Stand about the project, particularly if you're a South Side resident or if you know people, please spread the word that they're looking to garner comments. They're saying they'll accept letters to the editor up to 350 words on I81. They'll be reviewed by their editors and compiled in a collection of perspectives by and for South Side residents. And We have a South Side resident here today, 24 years living on the South Side, and an activist working in various activities on the South Side. We've been talking with Aggie for a little while, trying to get her here because it's an important piece of the I81 project, but it's also an important piece of the sustainability of our community. And just so you know, local economic resilience with a diversified economic base that is fair and equitable is trait number 2 of the Greening USA's 12 traits of a sustainable community. So this is an important topic from a variety of perspectives. So Aggie is here today to talk about that. She's a retired carrier engineer. She's a community gardener and a neighborhood activist. She co-founded Beyond Boundaries, a group dedicated to interrupting personal and internalized racism. She has worked on with the Partnership for Onondaga Creek to intercede on behalf of Southside residents relation to the Midland Ave Regional Treatment plant. Remember that? That goes back a few years, but that was another one of our big projects here in Syracuse. In 2011, the partnership joined with other groups and started the Urban Jobs Task Force, which I won't tell you much about that. I'll let Aggie do that. She has worked with the Peace Corps as a teacher in Nigeria. She's also been a teacher at Lemoyne College and other primary and secondary schools. And we are pleased that you are with us today to share your thoughts on urban jobs and the I81 project. So I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay. And okay. Well, thank you, John. That was very nice introduction. And I know a number of people in the room, and maybe some of you know most of this presentation. You've heard it before, but if you haven't, I hope I do a good job. Usually, Andrew Kroom from Legal Services, he's the attorney that worked with us on this. This is his slideshow, and he couldn't be here, and he does a very good job, so I hope I do him proud. So we just want, I guess, want to say, it'd be very clear. People get the Urban Jobs Task Force a little mixed up with other workforce development groups and thinking that we're providing jobs and we're doing job placement. No, we're fighting for opportunities. We're fighting for this, to make sure that there's some inclusion where there's often not inclusion. And where we can fight is when there's taxpayer and public money involved. It's hard to fight a private entity. So that's where all of our struggle has been, around public money. So I81, a lot of public money in that. And so we would like to see a change. So let's see if this thing works. Let's see. Should I try enter rather than the little arrow there? Okay. So we decided to do this report, partly because for the 8 years that we've been going, the Urban Jobs Task Force, we watch a whole lot of construction sites, and we do a lot of turkey necking, you know, who's working on the site? Are there any black or brown people working on the site? I wonder where all these people are coming from. Are they Syracuse residents? And we felt we knew the answer, that there wasn't a whole lot of minorities on a construction work site. And we had a sense that they probably were coming from out of town. But you need data. So we decided to actually get the data and ask this question after we looked at the data. So we foiled for 3 big projects, I-690, the airport Hancock project, the Expo Center at the State Fair. The county gave us the Lakeview project, and we got the data from the Joint School Construction Board. So why those 5? They're fairly local. Some are on the edge of the city, some are in the city, and they all had project labor agreements, which means there's an agreement between the building trades and whoever the lead agency is, which is to govern the workforce and to provide skilled workers, but also to make sure there's not workforce disruptions and things like that. But what often happens with the project labor agreement is if you're not in the union, you're not going to get work, or there's not a whole lot of opportunities. So we wanted to look at how that was playing out, because I-690 was a project labor agreement. So maybe I-81 will have 1 or more project labor agreements. So we were very lucky. We got a data analyst who, even when we had lots of records, was able to actually go after the data in the records. And where we could actually discern race by the individual records, sometimes not every record's not going to have that on it. Where we could, on 3 projects, I-690, the amphitheater project, and the airport project. And it turned out that they were overwhelmingly white, 88% of the workforce. And so it's a little concerning. Syracuse is pretty much 50% white. The county is, 76% white. So we just feel like there's not racial equity based on our own demographics. The other problem is, this is I-690 data, that whatever minorities are in the trades, they're pretty much confined to semi-skilled laborers and iron workers. A lot of native indigenous people are iron workers. But it gets pretty thin in all the other trades. And we've been pushing that whatever training is going on in Syracuse has to get way beyond what has been happening. That SUNY EOC trains people to get them on a construction site, especially if there's a goal, like there is on the joint school construction renovation projects. And they give people just enough to maybe get hired. And that means that they give them what is called OSHA 10, which is a safety course, and they give them this sort of core curriculum, which is the very basics. And then they get them on a site, maybe. And then nobody's really following them. There's no continuing that with that person. And we need to change that. And the mayor has announced he wants to have something called Syracuse Build. and train people, and we really want in-depth training. So we want a city workforce that has carpenters, has masons, that has electricians, HVAC people. And so we want to get beyond it, where that people just get to be unskilled or semi-skilled laborer.
Everybody,
Yeah.
just mute all.
You can make an announcement telling people to mute themselves.
Yes, would people on the webinar please mute yourself? We are hearing disruptive noise here in the room. That's just weird because it says only one person is here. It says everyone's muted, so now I'm really.
Well, maybe I'm spent, you know,
It's not you. I don't know what's going on, but please
They
continue.
left. You turn off the mic.
Everyone, no, I didn't. No, no.
So the other thing is, where do the workers come from? How many of them come from Syracuse? And that's hard data to get. We're still trying to get it on I-690. We foiled them just recently for a third time. We got it on the Hancock project, and we got it on the Lakeview project. And we did not get it on, as I say, the I-690 and the other state project. And it has something to do with privacy, and that zip code is part of the address, and that they can't give it to you, but they're working with us right now. So we'll see if we get it on this final foil. But what our interest is, how many Syracusans benefit from these big, big local jobs? They're prevailing wage, so they're good jobs. And as you can see from this slide, the red is the people living in Syracuse. And so if, for example, on the I81 projects, there isn't some sort of provision, and we'll get into that later, Syracusans won't work. If you just look at the data, if we can't figure out how to change the system, we're not going to benefit from those jobs. And that's why we are out there fighting. We did this report to try to figure out how can we make a change to that system. So the other really concerning thing was some data on the I-690 project. So as I said, the mayor's announced Syracuse Build. He wants to get people trained for I81 and for all the other development going in the city. And we think that's great. But if you're an apprentice, you might not work on that big project. And so the percentage of apprentice hours on the I-690 project was 4%. And the people of color who were apprentices only got 0.5%. That's not the kind of data we want to see after I81 is done. We want to see real opportunity for people in Syracuse. And if they go through a training, we want to make sure they get on that job. So you ask, well, You know, how come people aren't on those jobs? So you've heard this probably in many other presentations, but we've got a lot of segregation in this city. And a lot of it stems way back from redlining, which is this slide here on the left. And I don't want to go into redlining, but is there anybody in the room who would like me to describe what redlining is? Or you already know? Everybody knows. Okay. The other one is Syracuse Geography helped us map a whole lot of data, and this is one of their mappings. And you can see that poverty is hovering right around the I81, right around where redlining happened. So some of the poorest neighborhoods, actually one of the poorest is, I think you can probably see it here, it's 42. It's really Pioneer Homes and right around there. So it's going to be really affected. And so you're going to have people making really good wages right outside their door. And how galling that's going to be if you're trying to figure out how to move yourself out of this situation. So, and that you get some of that economic benefit. So it's just to understand that the city struggles with poverty, and we call it concentrated poverty because it comes out of that segregation that our society practiced and still does. But there are a lot of, out of poverty, there are a lot of ways that also make it hard for you to get into the trades. Most of the trade unions, almost all of them, trying to think I don't think there's even one, I don't even think the laborers, I think you'll all need either a GED or a high school diploma. Almost all of them also expect you to have a driver's license. All of them expect you to have reliable transportation. You don't have to own a car, but you have to ensure that you can get around reliably. There's childcare, there's conviction records, and one of the biggest things is just the limited network that you have available to you. And it's one of the biggest barriers, I feel, to getting into the trades, and we have to break that down and expand those networks and those opportunities. So why not just do like the Joint School Construction did? They put a 20% residency requirement in their project labor agreement. Actually, they did it beforehand and basically told the building trades, you want a project labor agreement? You're going to have to make sure that 20% city residents work. They already had a 10% minority and 10% women. It was part of what the Urban Jobs Task Force actually asked that board to do. And they took them a long time to negotiate with the trades. Trades weren't too happy about the 20% because most of their union members don't live in the city. So why don't we just do that? Well, we've got a little problem. First of all, it has federal dollars in it. One federal dollar means that the federal rules trump on the project. Excuse me, I shouldn't use his word today. Anyway, so these goals were set based on the 1970 census and haven't changed since. So nationally, every federal project has to have 6.9% women on it. And then each area, and ours is the Syracuse MSA, which is Onondaga County, Oswego County, and Madison County, I believe. And ours is set at 3.8% for minorities. They said when they set these goals that they were going to raise them when they had another census. Well, they never did, and they don't plan to, unless there's, I guess, a whole lot of outcry. So that's one. Those goals are really low. Even though we made, I think, 12% in general, I think 12% it was on the I-690 project. It's interesting when I feel that they're hiring watching the goal. I think the women goal was like 6.98. So people need the goals too, and it's good to have high enough goals so that some opportunity happens and that people aren't just, as soon as they meet the goal, okay, we don't need to hire any more women, any more minorities. So the biggest concern for us, because we'd like to see Syracusans working on this, is the federal regulations don't allow you to have what they call a local geographical preference. So Obama tried to get around that, if you will, or try to change that. He put into what he called SEP 14. It was a pilot project. And he said, on federal infrastructure projects, you can hire, have a local goal, like a 20% for Syracusans. So we actually went to the I-690 hearing. And half of the speakers were from the Urban Jobs Task Force. We had big signs saying, hey, we want local hire. We want you to put in an application to SEP 14 and get local hire on I-690. And they said, oh, okay. And then later on, a few days later, they said, it's a problem. 90% of the PLA is already negotiated with the trades. So they said, well, we'll do it on I81. So they wrote it for I81 and they sent it in the last month of Obama's administration. And the FHWA, Federal Highway Administration, said, hey, it looks good. But guess what? You can't submit it because you haven't picked an option yet. So wait till you pick an option and then resubmit it. And they said, okay. And then Trump got rid of it and put it back to the old way, where you can't have a local geographical preference. So we're back there. So how do you get around that? What can you do? Well, LA figured it out before SEP 14. And they decided, okay, we'll call out all the distressed census tracts in the nation. And anybody who lives in a distressed census tract, well, they can get hired on it. You got to have, and they put the goal in a project labor agreement with the trades. And the goal was 40% of all hours have to go basically to low income people living in these distressed census tracts. And then they had a good goal for the apprentices. 20% of all the hours had to be for apprentices. And half of those hours had to go to people living in low-income census tracts. And then they put in a goal for disadvantaged people. And they had like 9 criteria. And if you met 2 of them, you were a disadvantaged person. And 10% of those workers had to be from that. And there were things like, were you a veteran? Have you been incarcerated? Are you a single custodial parent? They did a whole bunch, and just 2 of them. And the feds said, hey, you're not violating that rule. So that's a good model. We also know that if you scream and shout, make enough noise, you get something. Now, the people outside Denver, around Denver, for the I-70, actually put in a Title VI around discrimination. They lost, but then they got these mitigation measures. So training dollars would be good to get from the DOT. You know, and we talk a whole lot with the New York Civil Liberties Union, who is working on all the other equity problems around housing and environmental justice. And so we all have to make a whole lot of noise so that in the record of decision that there are some community, some commitments to the community. So I did some research recently on community benefits agreements. And there's an interesting project out there. Cleveland Hospitals had a $1.2 billion project. And they are in a very poor neighborhood. And they decided, sort of like the I81 is going to go through one of the poorest neighborhoods. Well, Cleveland Hospital said, we need to figure out how to hire people from the surrounding area. And that some of these good jobs could be a way for people to have a career, construction. And they just sat down and brought a whole lot of people to the table. And the trade unions were really not going along with it. So they brought elected power into the room. And they also, basically, their congresswoman basically told them, you're not leaving the room unless you would agree to some of these provisions for the community. Or you're not going to get a project labor agreement. That's bottom line. If you want this agreement that sort of makes union jobs the priority on it, then you need to agree. And there's a whole interesting study on it, but we decided we need to learn from that. These are what we need to do. We need to actually get a lot of people out at the DEIS hearing, hopefully, I'm not sure when it is, I guess it's springtime now, and really make a real impression on them that people want these jobs to flow into Syracuse. And we've been making our rounds and talking about this study to all our elected leaders. And we've been asking them, we need to have a big table. It was actually Schumer's office that told them, don't ask the governor to call the big table. Ask your mayor to do that. And so we've asked our mayor. And he said yes. Then we went to see the New York State DOT, the head of the project, and said, we want you to participate in that big table. And we got it in writing that yes, they would. So it's a beginning. We'll see. You got to get the trades, you got to get all the advocates, and you got to, yeah, I don't know. There needs to be a way to do what Los Angeles did. Figure out some community workforce provisions. If it's a PLA, or even if it's a request for proposals, an RFP, to get them in the governing document. So they're real goals, that they're tracked, and then that they're enforceable. And just to show you that you can have all the good intentions. So the I-690 PLA has some really good language around apprentices, and we saw the data. Nobody was tracking it. No one early on was saying, hey, this isn't working. We need to figure out why. And that's what you need to do. And I have a petition here basically calling for what we call them CWA/PLA, community workforce agreement, which is a PLA that the unions have signed on to that has workforce provisions in them. And if you're so disposed, I'll pass it down and around, and maybe we can talk about what's on your mind. So that's what we've been doing for actually 2 years probably. Yeah.
You know, what was the total cost of the Denver I-70 project? I'm just wondering the ratio of 400,000 for training versus the total cost of the project. It's a sense of what you might ask.
No, I'd have to look it up and study to see if it's in there. I don't have it on the top of my. I could see. If I could, yeah, go ahead.
What's the distinction between a community workforce agreement and a community benefits agreement?
A lot of the way I look at them, community benefits agreements often have community workforce provisions in them, but they may have things like affordable housing, they may have a grocery store, they may have a community center, they have often a lot of other benefits. But a project labor agreement is about the workforce and the labor, and so that's why we're using that.
Aggie, if you could talk into the microphone for the benefit of recording.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So the question was, should I repeat?
No,
Yeah.
This may have picked it up. So.
Okay. So the big question was, what is the difference between a community benefits agreement and a community workforce agreement? Something like that, I think. And one usually has a lot more benefits to the community than just jobs. It often has things like community centers or grocery stores, affordable housing. They're big agreements. Any other questions? Yeah.
So from the projects that were successful that you put up on the slides there, were you able to discern any kind of common thread that made them work? Because, I mean, if there's no incentive, it's not going to happen. So for those that were successful, what was their formula? Were you able to distill out any kind of common formula for success?
To a point. The biggest thing is the goals need to get embedded into the project labor agreement, so they're part of it. They can't, so the county on the lake, on the amphitheater project had embedded their goals into that, and they met them, just met them. And in the Joint School Construction Board project labor agreement for the renovation of the schools, all those goals are embedded in the agreement. Now, I would say the Joint School Construction Board is the only one that is tracking them from day one with a package called LCP Tracker. It tracks certified payroll. And so you have all the data throughout the project, and you know when you're off course, and then you can sit down and try to get it back on course so that you meet the goals.
Can that tracking methodology be put into the contract?
I think so, yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. And that's part of what Cleveland hospitals did. And they made it, they actually, so they were a private institution. You usually don't see this, but they actually paid, oh gosh, I can't remember, something like $3 million to an outside company to actually monitor it, track it. And when it went off course, that company was responsible to getting the parties sit down and try to figure out ways so that the goals would be met. Bottom line, without tracking and without some sort of mechanism to enforce the goals, or make it possible to meet them, you really just have a whole lot of language. Yeah.
I wanted to get a clarification, and I might be late to the party. You probably have, do you want me to hold it? Okay. You might have covered this in another green bag lunch, but in the EIS process for NEPA, there is no function for economic, social, or psychological issues. The trick is really to tie it to natural environment, built environment, and human health. So are you hoping at the DEIS public hearing that you'll be able to get a forum for having this discussion, or are you actually trying to add something to the DEIS itself?
I think what we're trying to do is put enough pressure
Mm-hmm.
on the New York State DOT to actually have a negotiated agreement.
Okay.
With the building trades, if that's who they're going to sit down with, like they did on I-690.
Yeah.
And they seemed back then, and they're giving all the right lip service. Yes, yes, we care, we understand. It would be fair that people in Syracuse and affected communities should work. But again, words are cheap.
Right. No, I just think it might be tricky because if somebody were to say, well, this is not the purpose of the DEIS, I mean, that the trick is to really get the folks at the table to have this additional conversation, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
I think the only other thing I can say, and that we've, in our study, which you can get on our website,
Mm-hmm.
Is the past history of I81 is so awful.
Oh, yeah, and none of the processes were followed. Oh, no, it's a
I
disaster. I
think-
totally agree.
I'm thinking that they're aware that we're hammering away at that.
Right.
That reparations, in a sense, need to be done.
Mm.
And this is one way that you could do reparations, is make sure people get a chance at those good paying jobs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, actually, NEPA does allow for social and economic variables to be included in the DEIS analysis. Right. Wait, so if you look at chapter 6, for example, in the DEIS, there's a whole section there. And the key is, as Aggie pointed out, and DOT actually provides the ammunition to do this in the historical context of one of the appendices, where they point to red line and they point to multiple federal, state, and local policies from 1937 on that demonstrate how federal policies, including the construction of I-81, did, as a matter of fact, disadvantage minorities. And that allows for the foundation of, in those chapters of the DEIS, bringing hiring into the equation. The problem is that they didn't do that in the first draft of that. So as Aggie says, it's real critical for people to get out at the hearing and address that so it does get into the final environmental impact statement.
I think one thing that's going through my head is what we did on the Midland Avenue sewage plan. When the negotiations failed, we actually filed a Title VI complaint to the EPA because they were the agency putting in $40 million into that plant. And a federal agency can't discriminate by funding a discriminatory project. And so we're doing our research on Title VI's and highway projects. So I-70 did have a Title VI. They didn't win, but it makes a lot of also good press, and it's part of the pressure to make them do right. And Baltimore had one, and as I remember, I don't think they won, but it was a strong suit. So we're learning about, actually, this is called a racial equity impact statement, and it's trying to be proactive rather than using Title VI, which is sort of a reactive way. It's after you've been discriminated against that you want a remedy or mitigate and payment for that. And we would rather not wait until there's discrimination.
Might add briefly to that some of the more successful environmental justice activism nationally is, for example, Push Buffalo more recently has been more successful in environmental and in other realms because of being taking a proactive approach rather than reactive.
I was about to mention Push Buffalo. They had a presentation 2 weeks ago. I was fortunate to attend. The three main players at that table was DEC, New York State Department of Transportation, and on top of that, they had NYSERDA, which is the pocketbook.
Right, right.
The way they did that presentation, we were able to videotape some of the segments, but they're doing it from a 13-state perspective. So what we want to be able to do, take the best of Buffalo, Albany, Cornell, bring those packages together so we focus locally, but we act for more regional perspective to include the other states. That way you trump the small guys who are big guys in this little pond.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aggie, for an interesting presentation. Assuming that the community grid option goes through, which we think it will now, and we don't know exactly, of course, when actual construction would start, but let's say it might be in 2021. But the predicted schedule is for 5 years, and it could be. Probably won't be less, but it might be more. And the cost estimates are creeping up toward $2 billion. And one of the rules of thumb on construction jobs is that it's half labor and half materials and stuff. So if you do the arithmetic and you divide $1 billion by 5 years and divide that by $50,000 a year, and that's going to be one of my questions. What do you think the labor rates will be on that job? It comes out to 4,000 jobs for 5 years. So I think I heard the mayor saying, and maybe you know about this, that there's going to be a labor shortage. And maybe you could talk about those issues.
Taking a look at the DEIS and the hours projected, it's really hard to figure out actually the number of jobs. But looking at like carpenters are like one of the biggest skills needed on it. And we have a good relationship with the Carpenters Union, and they are trying to recruit apprentices, journey people. And there was a great story where they interviewed a man on the south side, and they could see that his skills, he was at journey person level, and they brought him right on in at that level. And so they're interviewing people, trying to find those skilled carpenters that are maybe out there, but have, because of your networks or whatever, you don't know about them. And so there may be a shortage, and usually what happens is if it's a project labor agreement, union workers from other states come on. So on some of these projects, I think it was some carpenters out of somewhere in Pennsylvania, they made tremendous amount of money. It was amazing how much they took back to Pennsylvania. So that could happen. And construction workers are used to traveling, so they find it's lucrative, and it will be lucrative. That's why we're a little worried. Even when you call out distress census tracts throughout the nation, you might get a lot of people from downstate coming on up. But yeah.
I'll sneak in before Bob. This is wrap-up question. Aggie, thank you for all your efforts in this regard, and of course with the sewer plant on Midland Avenue and everything. And this is an incredible bureaucracy at DOT, all the DOTs that you have to deal with the regional office, Albany, DC. Are you, and I apologize, I was late, but I asked Diane and she said you hadn't touched on that. I was curious if you have leveraged at all those different levels, because my experience in the past is that whereas you may have reticence, for example, and here regionally, maybe some possibilities in Albany and US DOT, there are offices there. It's such a huge operation, the US DOT. It's formidable, but there are a number of people that would probably be willing to help off the record, if not on the record. So I'm just curious if you guys have made a trip down there, and it's a lot of work, a lot of time. I know I'm not asking you to do more than you already are, but I'm just curious if you've thought about that.
We actually haven't traveled. We spent the summer actually talking to all of our elected officials, and so, the local people at Schumer's office were really helpful. Gillibrand's office, especially because they wrote a legislation called Build Local, Hire Local, and it is about exactly sort of what we would want, like 50% need to be local workers and all. Gillibrand's written that legislation, and there's a House version of it, but I think they know it's not going anywhere until they change either the Senate or the White House. So, but it is, they're very, so we've been talking to them, and the DOT at our last meeting brought in people from civil rights. People were, I'm not sure exactly where there was people from the FHWA there. So it's been a summer of making the rounds, and we really want to get that big table. So these elected officials seem to be perfectly willing to be part of that big table, so that there's true equity going on in a discussion. So that's what we're hoping for.
I'm just thinking that there's probably bureaucrats in DC at US DOT that are hiding out currently, but are still in place because they're civil service, and that they would probably be willing to help off the record. It is a huge, US DOT is, a huge operation, and there might be some free help that way. But it's a matter of, getting in the door. You can probably use the electeds to get in the door and then work your way through.
Well, it's actually, some of, I think, people have put us, like for example, in contact with the NAACP legal defense. And we've asked, I think, Gillibrand's office to connect us to Congresswoman Bass, who's head of the Black Caucus. So we're thinking of all the ways we can put pressure on this situation so it's not too late. We don't want to be late this time.
Aggie, you mentioned Gillibrand's Build Local, Hire Local bill, which, as you indicated, isn't going to go anywhere under the current Congress. But it's my understanding that she did actually get some of the training dollars that were in that bill and some of the local hiring dollars included in the current infrastructure bill, so that assuming the budget passes, that there will actually be some training dollars available during the next budget cycle. Have you had any more communication with her office about that? The state of that?
They send me, I was a little confused at the press conference when she talked about it. And I realized it was the current infrastructure bill. And she did get something in there for communities that have viaducts and something around, as you say, some dollars and some training. So yeah, we need to leverage it all.
Aggie, thanks again. This report, I've only been looking at it a short time.
Yeah.
but it's terrific to see it because I think it's the serious and objective look at the data on projects. I wanted to just mention a few very positive things that are following this about the microphone. One about the labor issue. Yesterday morning, I saw the presentation by Syracuse University's Director of Facilities, Pete Sala, and he spoke to their constant annual budget, which is incredible right now, what's going on at SU, and the shortage of qualified labor to do their work. And also through B. Gonzalez, the university's training programs. And the good news is to this whole group, and I'm sure you know this being part of it, is that they're going to the mayor's Syracuse Bill Roundtable to bring that experience to that Syracuse Bill Roundtable so that you have a stronger argument for training and for local jobs based on Syracuse University's heavy construction experience. Bring that to a contractable, negotiable outcome. So that's positive things that are going around because of our experience in the city. The other hearing also that we should go, just as Lisa has mentioned, we should go to Albany and contact the other agencies, the other DOTs, federal and state, not just local. And the reason is when you go there, they know these issues are old issues that need to be dealt with. And they're not, and you don't have to negotiate that just through our local DOT and have them always pushing them. If you go to Albany, then and get new batteries. Sorry. Then Albany, I'm going to let you have this. Shouldn't do that. Then these agencies, in fact, agency for was here from Albany hearings down to the local DOT. They wanted to hear different things than the local DOT was telling them. So it's very important to make strong cases and to write them with serious letters that have to be addressed to Albany to support Albany for what we're advocating for from our local DOT. So there's a lot of positive things you can do.
I thank you for bringing that up and Lisa bringing it up because I remember on the Midland Avenue sewage plant, we went to Albany and sat down with that DEC, and then they started telling the local DEC what you will or won't do, and to listen to us. And so I should try to remember that. And actually, our group hasn't talked about that, but maybe that's what we should do. Yeah. And if you have contacts or people at that Albany DOT, we would love them.
Great. I got some.
Okay.
That's a mute button. Hold it by the bottom.
Thanks, Aggie. I agree that this was a wonderful presentation. A thought comes to my mind in terms of we're discussing coalitions and agencies to relate to. Have you worked with, besides these other examples of some communities, LA, Cleveland, whatever, there probably are other cities that are dealing with the same type of problems, especially with the FHWA projects. And I'm wondering if there is some coalition of depressed communities who are working on this, and if that might be an avenue to gain some support and resources to help push this forward.
There's a really big coalition that we've learned a lot from and gotten some help from. It's called the Partnership for Working Families. There are big groups like Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, Lane, that had a lot to do with that LA Metro. And they have people there that if we really wanted to sit down and unpack actually how that went and how they got to that point, we probably could call them up and do that. I think, yeah, it's always a scramble to, the city of Cleveland actually came here and spoke about community benefits agreements in 2014. I knew the person in public affairs, and they, we used their residency law that they had on the books, and we used that as a draft. Then we drafted our own for Syracuse, and then it sent it on to the Common Council to finish the process of turning that into a law. So there have been some cities. The biggest one right now for us is City Build out of San Francisco. Evan Weissman, who teaches up at SU, his cousin is the director of economic development for the city of Syracuse, and had a lot to do with getting City Build up and running. He's willing to give us curriculum, just how they do their database and that. So there are some people around the country that have been really helpful.
Fantastic. Now, I want to ask another question, not about this project, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that warehouse project that the county recently authorized. I know that there might be some other hurdles for it to get approved yet, but I'm wondering what the Urban Job Task Force thinks about all that.
Well, we actually didn't talk about it a whole lot, and even though there was a lot of concern about it, I guess I have mixed feelings about where to put our energy. It was an OSIDA project, so it was a county project. It was the residents of Clay, right, or Cicero, if I've got it right, that are going to be the ones that have to live with that warehouse. And so warehouse jobs may be better than some of the low-wage work people have. What was, I guess, hard for people is they felt like they weren't sure whether they were just giving Amazon, a big break, and they just, the transparency and all. We put a lot of our energy into SIDA, which is Syracuse Industrial Development Agency, and the mayor is looking at a policy and maybe how to incentivize our developers when they get a tax break to hire out of our city. So when you get a project, besides they put down how much construction wages, and we would like to see a portion of those construction wages stay in our city and circulate in our city. So there's conversations now about that. So that's mainly where we put our energy.
Well, very good. Well, I suppose if there aren't any other questions, I think we can say thank you. Okay. And let's give Aggie a round of applause. And we'll look forward to hearing from you in the future and being, hopefully, to be able to support this effort at the hearing whenever they get around to scheduling that in the future. So thank you. I'll give the microphone to Diane in case she has something else to say.
I was remiss at the beginning, and I did not thank the Syracuse Center of Excellence for the use of their beautiful facility and their wonderful technology. And also thank all of you for being here and giving up time during your day to talk with Aggie about such a really important issue. Greening USA has been around since 2003, the brainchild of Dave Ashley. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Not one of us gets a penny for what we do. If you believe that we bring value to our community, we wholeheartedly urge you to consider membership. I know I'm getting those emails. It's that time of year. Please donate. So So if you believe, once again, we offer up monthly green bag lunches. We have a newsletter that helps to promote the events of like-minded organizations. We have our Sustainability Academy, which is grassroots education that we bring to the zoo every spring in April. And for the last 2 years, we brought it to the New York State Fair. And our annual meeting for the last several years has included like-minded organizations who stand up and talk about what they're doing so that we can create some synergies between all of those organizations. So once again, and by all means, we have vacancies on our board. If you are interested in exploring involvement with our organization, please talk to one of us. But thanks again for being here, and thanks to Aggie. Great job.
Again, this is on our website. It's on that brochure. You can download it. Double sided, it's 100 pages.
No, you did okay. Yes, that is controlled by the local. That's why I cut it out. But it's